The night was quiet, the highway nearly empty as Veronica Caldwell, the newly appointed FBI director, drove home after a long day. Her mind was still occupied with the classified briefing. She had just left. The road stretched ahead, illuminated by flickering streetlights, their glow reflecting off her sleek black sedan. She was used to long hours and even longer nights, but what she wasn't prepared for was a sudden burst of red and blue lights in her rear-view mirror. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel as she glanced at the speedometer. 65 miles per hour, exactly the limit. She hadn't been speeding or driving erratically, yet the police cruiser behind her persisted. Reluctantly, she signaled and pulled over to the shoulder, her instincts sharpening as the officer took his time approaching her car. The seconds ticked by slowly as Veronica waited, her eyes flicking between the rear-view mirror and the dashboard clock. The officer's delay was unusual, and it set off a quiet alarm in her mind. She had spent years in law enforcement, rising through the ranks to become one of the most respected figures in the FBI. She knew the protocols, the procedures, and the unspoken rules of the road. But something about this stop felt off. The cruiser's lights continued to flash, casting alternating red and blue shadows across the interior of her car. She exhaled slowly, steadying her nerves. This was just a routine stop, she told herself. Nothing to worry about. Yet, the unease lingered. When the officer finally stepped out, Veronica noticed a stiff, almost aggressive posture. His left hand rested near his firearm, while his right swung a flashlight back and forth. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across her car before settling on her face. She lowered her window, keeping both hands visible on the wheel, and greeted him calmly. "Evening, officer," she said, her voice steady and professional. But the officer didn't return the courtesy. Without offering a reason for the stop, he demanded her license and registration. His tone was clipped, his words devoid of any warmth or professionalism. Veronica, maintaining her composure, asked why she had been pulled over. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" she inquired, her tone even but firm. The officer, chewing his gum, stared at her for a moment too long before repeating his demand. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat and unyielding. Veronica hesitated, her instincts screaming that this was a routine. She had been in countless situations where authority figures tried to assert dominance, but this felt different. There was an edge to the officer's demeanor, a simmering aggression that made her wary. She reached for her purse slowly, retrieving her wallet and offering her FBI credentials along with her driver's license. "I'm FBI Director Veronica Caldwell," she said, holding out the identification. But the officer didn't take them. Instead, he glanced at her ID and then back at her, his expression unreadable. "FBI, huh?" he muttered, almost to himself. Then, without warning, he ordered her to step out of the vehicle. Veronica's heart rate quickened, but she kept her breathing steady. She had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, to remain calm when others would panic. But this was different. This wasn't a hostage negotiation or a tactical operation. This was a traffic stop on a quiet highway, and yet it felt like a trap. She knew the statistics, the stories of people, especially people of color, being pulled over for no reason, only for the situation to escalate into something far more dangerous. She had read the reports, seen the footage, and now, for the first time, she was living it. "On what ground, officer?" she asked, her voice firm but controlled. She wasn't about to comply without a valid reason. The officer's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer to the car. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Veronica's mind raced. She knew that refusing to comply could be seen as resisting, but stepping out of the car would put her in a vulnerable position. She glanced at the officer's nameplate. D. Kearns. She would remember that name. Before she could decide her next move, Kearns reached for the door handle. The click of the mechanism sent a jolt through Veronica's body. She reacted instantly, her left hand shooting out to grip the inside handle, preventing him from opening the door. "Sir, step back," she ordered, her voice firm but measured. "You're outside of protocol." Kearns didn't move. If anything, his grip on the door tightened, his knuckles paling under the strain. "I said step out of the car," he growled. his voice low and menacing. Veronica's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and in a position where any move she made could be misinterpreted. She had dealt with men like Kearns before, men who mistook authority for dominance, who pushed boundaries to see how much they could get away with. But this wasn't some power-hungry bureaucrat in a suit. This was a man with a badge, a gun, and a temper that made him dangerous. She tightened her grip on the door handle, her mind racing through her options. The tension in the air was palpable, pressing against her ribs like a weight. She could feel the officer's impatience, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. She knew how fast things could spiral out of control. She had seen it happen before, both in her career and in the countless reports that crossed her desk. But she wasn't about to let fear dictate her actions. Veronica Caldwell had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this, and she wasn't going down without a fight. Just as the situation seemed poised to escalate further, a voice cut through the night. "Hey, I'm recording this." The shout came from somewhere off to the side, piercing through the thick tension like a blade. Veronica turned her head slightly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and saw a man standing near the edge of the road, his phone raised. The glow of the screen reflected off his glasses, and the red recording light was unmistakable. The witness's presence changed everything. Kearns hesitated, his confidence wavering as he glanced toward the man. The second officer, who had been standing silently by, shifted uncomfortably. Veronica seized the moment. "Put the weapon down, officer," she said, her voice cutting through the air with authority. Kearns didn't move, but the shift in his stance was immediate. The arrival of the witness had tipped the balance, and Veronica knew she had to push. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone icy. Kearns' jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. The second officer's radio crackled, and the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Backup was coming, but not the kind Kearns had hoped for. Within moments, more officers arrived on the scene. Veronica identified herself as the FBI director and demanded that Kearns and his partner be detained. The lieutenant in charge hesitated, but Veronica was unwavering. She insisted on full transparency, access to their disciplinary records, and an immediate internal affairs investigation. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a system that allowed such abuses of power to thrive. By dawn, the footage had gone viral. Kearns was stripped of his badge and charged with assault with a deadly weapon, while his partner was suspended indefinitely. The police department issued a carefully worded statement. But the truth was out, and the consequences were swift. Veronica watched the coverage from her office, knowing this was just the beginning. The calls, press conferences, and political maneuvering would follow, but she was determined not to let this be swept under the rug. Later, she received a call from the witness, who thanked her for taking a stand. Veronica, reflecting on the encounter, felt a glimmer of hope. Justice, she realized, doesn't happen in silence. It happens when people refuse to look away. This story was a reminder to speak up, to never let the truth go unheard. And Veronica Caldwell, with the power to make a difference, was just getting started. Veronica's instinct screamed that this wasn't routine. She had spent her career in law enforcement, climbed the ranks to become an FBI director, and knew the protocols inside and out. But this was different. The energy crackled with something darker, something outside the boundaries of standard procedure. The officer, his badge identifying him as Daniel Kearns, reached for her door handle. Reflexively, she gripped the inside handle, preventing him from opening the door. Her voice was firm, authoritative. "Step back, officer." Kearns didn't move. Instead, his fingers curled around the handle harder, as if testing whether she had the resolve to resist him. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his cap, studied her like a predator assessing its prey. The night air hung thick between them, the distant hum of traffic barely registering in Veronica's ears. A sense of isolation crept in. The road was dark. No immediate witnesses. The flashing red and blue lights of the squad car painted eerie streaks over the wet pavement. Then came a second officer. Another one. This one, younger, more rigid in posture, but his presence reinforced Kearns' aggression. His hand lingered near his utility belt, near his weapon. A surge of unease traveled through Veronica's spine. The second officer muttered something into his radio, his gaze sharp and impersonal. Veronica wasn't being treated as an FBI director. She wasn't being treated as a citizen. She was being treated as a suspect. Step out of the vehicle. It wasn't a request. Veronica calculated her next move. If she complied, she would be at their mercy. If she resisted, they would escalate. The thought of being forced onto ground, knees pressing into her back, flashed through her mind. She had seen this scenario before, too many times. With slow precision, she unlocked the door and pushed it open. Her hands remained visible, fingers spread wide, showing she wasn't a threat. The moment her feet hit the pavement, Kearns lunged. His grip was too tight, too fast, yanking her wrist with unnecessary force. Veronica snapped at him. "Let go." He tightened his hold. "Resisting, are we?" His voice dripped with mockery, his smirk barely concealed. The second officer's fingers grazed his radio, his voice cold. "We have a non-compliant suspect." That was all it took. Kearns drew his gun. The barrel hovered inches from Veronica's face. A deadly silence blanketed the scene. Her training screamed at her to remain still. Every FBI negotiation tactic, every crisis handling scenario she had drilled into recruits, now became her lifeline. Kearns's grip on the weapon was steady, too steady for someone improvising. He's done this before. She met his eyes, refusing to look at the gun. "Put away." Her voice was steel. "You have no cause." Kearns cocked his head. His lips curled into something between amusement and disdain. "Feeling powerful now, Director?" It wasn't about the stop. It wasn't even about law enforcement anymore. This was about power, about humiliation, about making a point. Then a voice cut through the tension. "Hey, I'm recording this." A man stood at the edge of the scene. Phone raised, the screen illuminated. The witness's voice was sharp, cutting to the charged atmosphere like a blade. Kearns hesitated. The second officer shifted, as if suddenly aware of the scrutiny. Veronica's heart pounded, not in fear, but in calculation. She could use this. "You're making a mistake," she told him, her voice steady. Kearns's jaw tensed. His finger lingered near the trigger, his hesitation warring with his instinct for control. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered the gun. The second officer, still gripping his radio, let his hand fall. Veronica inhaled, deep and controlled. She turned to the witness, locking eyes with him. "Keep recording." The man gave a quick nod. His phone didn't waver. Kearns exhaled sharply through his nose, his gaze flicking toward the camera. His jaw worked, irritation radiating off him. He took a single step back. Then another. Veronica didn't move. Seconds stretched into eternity. Finally, Kearns let out a low, forced chuckle. "Get out of here, Director." "Not ma'am, not agent, just Director," dripping with a kind of sarcasm that said he knew exactly what he was doing. Veronica didn't acknowledge it. She turned toward her car. The moment she touched the handle, Kearns added, "Next time, you won't be so lucky." Veronica paused. She glanced over her shoulder. Her eyes locked onto his. "Next time, Officer Kearns," she said, voice unwavering. "There won't be a next time." She slid into her car, shut the door, and started the engine. The witness was still recording. The second officer shifted on his feet. And Kearns? He just stood there, watching her drive away. But Veronica knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Hashtag, 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 a reckoning at dawn. The dynamic shifted. The moment the witness's voice cut through the night, Kearns lowered his gun, just slightly, but the damage was already done. His hand still hovered over his weapon, his eyes flickering between Veronica and the recording phone. For a brief moment, silence filled the space between them. The pulsing of police sirens in the distance signaled what was coming next. More officers arrived. Their vehicles skidded onto the scene, headlights slicing through the darkened street. Red and blue lights flickered across the pavement, bouncing off Veronica's car and illuminating Kearns's face. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed a sliver of uncertainty. Veronica seized the moment. With the weight of her authority pressing against the night, she stepped forward. "I am Director Veronica Caldwell of the FBI." Her voice rang out, clear and forceful. "These officers, Daniel Kearns and his partner, are to be detained immediately." A murmur rippled through the arriving officers. Some exchanged glances, uncertainty brewing in the thick air. The lieutenant in charge, a middle-aged man with sharp features and an air of exhaustion, took a deliberate step toward her. He eyed Kearns, then shifted his attention back to Veronica. "Ma'am," he started, voice measured, "we need to assess—" "There's nothing to assess." Veronica cut him off. "Your officers unlawfully detained me, used excessive force, and drew a weapon on a federal officer without cause." She gestured toward the witness. "It's all on video." The lieutenant hesitated. His shoulders tensed, as if torn between protocol and politics. Kearns, still standing rigidly, scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Veronica's sharp gaze locked onto him. "You're done talking." For the first time that night, Kearns seemed to understand he was no longer in control. The second officer, his partner, shifted uncomfortably. Unlike Kearns, his demeanor had cracked under the weight of the unfolding disaster. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and he cast anxious glances toward the approaching officers. Veronica turned back to the lieutenant. "I want access to their disciplinary records immediately. I want internal affairs notified. And I want these officers off the street. Asterisk, asterisk, now asterisk, asterisk." The lieutenant exhaled sharply, then nodded to two of his men. "Disarm them." The order sent a current through the group. Two officers stepped forward and reached for Kearns's firearm. His body went rigid. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. The officers ignored him, unbuckling his holster and relieving him of his weapon. His partner didn't resist, as they did the same to him. Veronica watched, unmoving, as the two were placed in squad cars, not as cops but as suspects. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about a system that allowed such abuses of power to thrive. And tonight, that system had been challenged. Hashtag the fallout. By dawn, the footage had gone viral. The video, shaky but damning, spread across news networks and social media like wildfire. Every major outlet replayed it, dissecting every second, every movement, every word. The clip of Kearns pressing his gun into Veronica's face became the defining image of a corrupt officer brought to justice. The headlines were relentless. FBI director held at gunpoint by rogue officer, caught on camera. Police corruption exposed. High-ranking agent takes stand. Power abuse in law enforcement. What happens now? The pressure was immediate. By mid-morning, Kearns was stripped of his badge and formally charged with assault with a deadly weapon. His partner, though less aggressive, was suspended indefinitely pending further investigation. The police department scrambled, issuing a carefully worded statement that condemned Kearns's actions but fell short of acknowledging systemic issues. But the public saw through it. Protests erupted outside the department's headquarters, voices demanding accountability. Veronica's name became a rallying cry, not because she had been a victim, but because she had refused to be silenced. Hashtag a battle begins. Veronica watched the coverage from her office. News anchors analyzed every angle. Legal experts debated the implications, and politicians lined up to either support or distance themselves from the growing controversy. She knew what came next. The calls, the press conferences, the political maneuvering. None of it surprised her. Her phone buzzed. Another request for a statement. Another interview. Another demand for comment. She let it ring. Instead, she exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. Then another call. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated for half a second before answering. "Director Caldwell," she greeted, professional as always. The voice on the other end was shaky, uncertain. "Director, it's me, the guy who recorded everything last night." Veronica sat up straighter. "Thank you," the man said, his voice carrying a weight that went beyond gratitude, "for not letting them get away with it." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, absorbing the significance of his words. "I should be thanking you," she replied. "If you hadn't recorded it, we wouldn't be having this conversation." A pause. Then his voice steadied. I just want to say that I've seen this happen before. To people who didn't have your power, your connections. And nothing ever happened to the cops who did it. Veronica understood. Deeply, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her desk. That's why we don't stop here. The man exhaled, as if relieved to hear those words. So what now? He asked. Veronica's gaze drifted to the television screen, where her own image flashed across the news. The fight wasn't over. Not even close. Now, she said, we keep pushing, because justice doesn't happen in silence. Justice happens when people refuse to look away. And Veronica Caldwell, with the power to make a difference, was just getting started, not by a long shot.